Imagine waking up and not being allowed to choose what you wear. Someone else picks your clothes. Someone else decides what you eat, when you eat, and who watches you eat it. Every meal is a performance. Every walk is a procession. And if you make one wrong decision, people die. That is what it was actually like to be a king. You have been told a story about kings. The story involves crowns and thrones and feasts and power. It involves men who commanded armies and bent nations to their will. And that story is true. But it is only half of it. The other half is something nobody tells you, because the other half is not glamorous, it is not inspiring. It is, in many ways, a life that most people living today would find completely unbearable. You think power means freedom. For a king, it meant the opposite. From the moment a king was born, his body was not his own. It belonged to the kingdom. His bloodline was a political asset. His health was a state secret. His moods were tracked, reported, and whispered about by the people closest to him. Historian Norbert Elias, in his landmark study The Civilizing Process, described the royal court as a gilded cage, a place where every gesture, every word, and every silence carried political weight. A king could not scratch his nose without someone reading it as a signal. Think about that. You could be the most powerful person in the known world and still not be able to take a walk alone. Kings were rarely alone, ever. They were surrounded from birth by a rotating cast of advisors, servants, guards, priests, nobles, and spies. At the French court of Versailles under Louis XIV, even the act of the king waking up was a public ceremony. It was called the lever. Dozens of nobles competed for the honor of handing the king his shirt. His morning routine was a spectacle with an audience. Historian William Beeke, who spent decades studying the French monarchy, described Versailles as a theater built specifically to make Louis XIV the permanent star of the show. The problem with being the permanent star of the show is that you never get to leave the stage. You never get to just be a person. And this was not unique to France. In China, emperors of the Han dynasty were surrounded by such elaborate ritual protocol that even their ministers were required to approach them on their knees, eyes down, never looking directly at the Son of Heaven. In Japan, the emperor was considered so sacred that many were effectively prisoners of their own divine status. They performed rituals, they received visitors, they issued decrees, but the real decisions were often made by shoguns and regents operating just outside the sacred radius. The emperor was the symbol. The symbol was not allowed to govern. Power does strange things to a life. Here is something that almost never gets mentioned. Kings were in constant physical danger, not the romantic danger of the battlefield, though that was real too, but the quiet, everyday danger of the people closest to them. The food tasters were not a luxury, they were a necessity. Historian Paul Friedman, in his research on medieval courts, documented the elaborate systems medieval kings built specifically to manage the threat of poison, tasters for every dish, different kitchens for different meals, servants who knew that their own survival depended on the king's survival. Paranoia was not a weakness, it was a rational response to reality. Because the reality was this: the people most likely to want you dead were often the people sharing your table. Your own brothers, your own sons, your own wife. The history of monarchy is saturated with family betrayal, at a level that would seem unbelievable if it were fiction. Richard II of England was deposed by his cousin. Byzantine Emperor Justinian II was overthrown twice and had his nose cut off the first time to disqualify him from ruling. Henry VIII did not simply wake up one morning and decide to create a new church because of theology. He was a man terrified of dying without a male heir, terrified of his dynasty collapsing, terrified of returning his kingdom to the civil war his own father had bled to end. His decisions, as ruthless as they were the decisions of a man who understood that the wrong heir meant chaos, and chaos meant bloodshed for millions of people. The weight of that is something most of us will never feel. Every king lived with a particular kind of loneliness. Psychologists studying extreme power, researchers like Dasha Keltner at UC Berkeley, whose work on power and social behavior has reshaped how we think about leadership, have found that the experience of power tends to isolate people. It distorts feedback. The people around you stop telling you the truth because telling the truth to a king was dangerous. So kings lived inside an information bubble of their own making. They heard what their advisors wanted them to hear. They saw what their courtiers chose to show them. And when they made decisions based on that filtered reality, sometimes entire kingdoms suffered for it. You might never know if your friends were real. A king could have hundreds of people who called themselves his loyal servants, and he could die, never knowing which of them would have betrayed him for the right price. That uncertainty was not paranoia, it was simply accurate. The Byzantine court alone changed hands through assassination or forced abdication over 30 times in its history. The Ottoman Empire, in periods of transition, had a practice called fratricide. Newly crowned sultans would have their brothers executed to eliminate rival claims to the throne, not because they were monsters, but because the alternative was civil war. This is the part of the crown nobody shows you: the isolation, the danger, the performance that never ends, the loneliness inside a palace full of people, the knowledge that your children might one day overthrow you, the knowledge that your most trusted advisor might be writing letters to your enemies, the knowledge that if you showed weakness, real weakness, not the calculated vulnerability of a skilled politician, but the raw human weakness of doubt or grief or exhaustion, your kingdom could fracture around you. And yet they kept doing it. Generation after generation, sons fought for the throne their fathers had built. Brothers killed brothers for the right to wear the crown. Men went to war over it. Women maneuvered in dangerous political shadows for it. Because even with all of this, the danger, the isolation, the performance, the paranoia, the alternative was worse. To not be king in a world built around kings was to be permanently vulnerable to the whim of whoever was. The aristocracy served the king because the alternative was to be crushed by a rival noble who had the king's ear. The king served the kingdom because the alternative was to be remembered as the ruler who let it fall. Power is always a transaction. You give something to get something. The question is always what you're willing to pay. The kings who lasted, the ones history remembers not just as rulers but as genuinely effective leaders, were almost always the ones who understood this the earliest. They understood that the crown was not a reward, it was a burden with benefits attached. They understood that the people watching them in court were not admirers. They were audiences who would stay loyal only as long as the performance remained convincing. Historian Barbara Tuchman, in her extraordinary analysis of medieval leadership, described the medieval king as a man who had to be simultaneously a warrior, a judge, a priest substitute, a diplomat, and a financial manager, and who had to appear effortlessly capable at all of it, in public, all the time. No days off, no sick days, no private life. So the next time you see a crown in a museum behind glass, lit dramatically, gleaming under the lights, try to feel the weight of it differently. Not the weight of gold and jewels, the other weight, the weight of every meal eaten in public, every decision made with incomplete information, every trusted advisor who might have been lying, every night spent wondering if tomorrow would be the day the conspiracy you did not know about finally came for you. The crown was not what made a king powerful. What made a king powerful, and what made the job nearly impossible, was knowing that the crown was only as heavy as the people below it chose to let it be. You thought power meant freedom. Now you know it never did.